Imagine a kingpin who operated not from the shadows, but in plain sight, his name a whisper in the corridors of power from Washington to Havana. A man who danced with the CIA, outlived his rivals, and was accused of plotting the most shocking murder in modern American history, yet never spent a single night in a federal prison. This is not a work of fiction. This is the story of Santo Trafficante Jr., the ghost don of the American underworld, a figure so enigmatic and so disciplined that his true power and influence may never be fully measured. While names like Al Capone and John Gotti became synonymous with flashy, violent notoriety, Trafficante cultivated a different kind of authority, one built on silence, patience, and an almost supernatural understanding of corruption. His empire was not confined to a single city like New York or Chicago. It was a transnational web, stretching from the bustling, cigar-scented streets of Tampa's Ybor city to the glittering, decadent casinos of pre-revolutionary Cuba, and its threads reached into the very heart of the American government during the tense years of the Cold War. This is a saga that begins not with a bang, but with a quiet arrival in a new world, and it spans nearly the entire 20th century, a dark tapestry woven with threads of crime, politics, espionage, and ultimate, unpunished survival. Before we descend into his world, we must issue a clear disclaimer. The narrative we are about to unfold is constructed from decades of law enforcement reports, congressional testimony, declassified intelligence documents, and historical accounts. Our sole purpose is to present a comprehensive and accurate picture of this complex figure for educational and informational purposes, piecing together a story that has been fragmented across countless sources. So, if you are ready to explore the life of the man who may have held the keys to some of America's darkest secrets, settle in, and let us begin this journey into the long, shadowy, and profoundly influential life of Santo Trafficante Jr. The story starts, as so many great American stories do, with an immigrant stepping off a boat with little more than a dream, though in this case, the dream would curdle into a quiet, relentless, and immensely profitable ambition. The sun in Tampa, Florida, in the early 20th century was a different kind of heat, thick with the humidity of the Gulf and the sweet, pungent aroma of curing tobacco leaves. Into this world, in the vibrant, multi-ethnic enclave of Ybor City, Santo Trafficante was born on November 15, 1914. He was not a self-made immigrant but the son of one, the heir apparent to a criminal enterprise that was already taking root. His father, Santo Trafficante Sr., was a Sicilian immigrant from Castellammare del Golfo, a town that would produce a staggering number of American Mafia figures. The senior Trafficante was a man of discipline and vision, who understood that the chaotic violence of the early gangsters was bad for business. He established himself not as a brash thug, but as a strategic businessman of the underworld. His initial domain was the boleta lottery, a numbers game immensely popular within the Cuban, Spanish, and Italian working-class communities of Ybor City. This was not a small-time operation. It was a sophisticated racket with an intricate network of runners, collectors, and bankers, generating a river of cash that flowed directly into the Trafficante coffers. Young Santo Jr. grew up immersed in this dual reality. On one hand, he was part of a community, attending school, living a life that appeared normal to the outside world. On the other hand, his education was not confined to the classroom. He was learning the family business at his father's knee, a postgraduate course in intimidation, profit-sharing, and the delicate art of political corruption. He watched as his father built alliances, not with loud proclamations, but with quiet handshakes and mutually understood threats. He learned that the most effective power was the power that went unnoticed, that the true ruler was not the one on the throne, but the one who whispered in the king's ear. This early education would become the bedrock of his entire philosophy. While other young men his age were dreaming of baseball or new cars, Santo Trafficante Jr. was learning how to balance ledgers, both legal and illegal, how to manage men driven by greed and fear, and, most importantly, how to build a wall of silence and loyalty that even the most determined law enforcement agency would struggle to breach. He saw his father operate with a calm, almost judicial authority, settling disputes between other criminals, and he internalized the supreme lesson: flash attracts attention, and attention attracts bullets and handcuffs. The boy was being molded into the man, the ghost, who would one day eclipse even his formidable father. The era of Prohibition, which began in 1920 when Santo Jr. was just 6 years old, was a godsend for the Trafficante family. While the Volstead Act was a social disaster for the nation, it was a massive economic stimulus package for organized crime. Tampa, with its long coastline and proximity to the Caribbean, became a prime hub for rum running. The Trafficante organization, already skilled in logistics and distribution through their Bolita operations, seamlessly expanded into bootlegging. They controlled wharves, bribed customs officials, and managed the flow of illicit alcohol from Cuba and the Bahamas into the thirsty mouths of America. This period supercharged their wealth and, more crucially, their political connections. The scale of this operation required the corruption of police, sheriffs, mayors, and judges. Santo Sr. was a master at this, understanding that a well-placed bribe was more valuable than a dozen hired guns. Young Santo Jr. was a keen observer during these formative years, witnessing firsthand how the underworld and the upperworld were not separate spheres, but deeply intertwined. He saw that the law was not a rigid barrier, but a malleable instrument that could be bent by the right application of money and influence. This was a critical insight that would define his entire career. As he grew into his late teens and early 20s, he was given more responsibility within the organization. He was not a frontline enforcer, that was for lesser men. His value was his mind, his calm demeanor, and his unwavering loyalty to his father's methods. He was being groomed. The death of his father in 1954 from natural causes was not a chaotic power struggle as seen in other crime families, it was a seamless transition of power. Santo Trafficante Jr., now 40 years old, had been the de facto leader for some time. He stepped into his father's shoes with the quiet assurance of a crown prince ascending to a throne he had been prepared for his entire life. The Tampa crime family was now his, but his vision was far grander than the Bolita rackets and local vice of Florida. He had his sights set on a jewel just off the coast, a place that was about to become the single most important nexus of money, power, and crime in the Western Hemisphere, the island of Cuba, and its dazzling capital, Havana. The sun in Tampa, Florida, in the early 20th century was a different kind of heat, thick with the humidity of the Gulf and the sweet, pungent aroma of curing tobacco leaves. Into this world, in the vibrant, multi-ethnic enclave of Ybor City, Santo Trafficante was born on November 15, 1914. He was not a self-made immigrant but the son of one, the heir apparent to a criminal enterprise that was already taking root. His father, Santo Trafficante Sr., was a Sicilian immigrant from Castellammare del Golfo, a town that would produce a staggering number of American Mafia figures. The senior Trafficante was a man of discipline and vision, who understood that the chaotic violence of the early gangsters was bad for business. He established himself not as a brash thug, but as a strategic businessman of the underworld. His initial domain was the Bolita lottery, a numbers game immensely popular within the Cuban, Spanish, and Italian working-class communities of Ybor City. This was not a small-time operation, it was a sophisticated racket with an intricate network of runners, collectors, and bankers, generating a river of cash that flowed directly into the Trafficante coffers. Young Santo Jr. grew up immersed in this dual reality. On one hand, he was part of a community, attending school, living a life that appeared normal to the outside world. On the other hand, his education was not confined to the classroom. He was learning the family business at his father's knee, a postgraduate course in intimidation, profit-sharing, and the delicate art of political corruption. He watched as his father built alliances, not with loud proclamations, but with quiet handshakes and mutually understood threats. He learned that the most effective power was the power that went unnoticed, that the true ruler was not the one on the throne, but the one who whispered in the king's ear. This early education would become the bedrock of his entire philosophy. While other young men his age were dreaming of baseball or new cars, Santo Trafficante Jr. was learning how to balance ledgers, both legal and illegal, how to manage men driven by greed and fear, and, most importantly, how to build a wall of silence and loyalty that even the most determined law enforcement agency would struggle to breach. He saw his father operate with a calm, almost judicial authority, settling disputes between other criminals, and he internalized the supreme lesson: flash attracts attention, and attention attracts bullets and handcuffs. The boy was being molded into the man, the ghost, who would one day eclipse even his formidable father. The era of Prohibition, which began in 1920 when Santo Jr. was just 6 years old, was a godsend for the Trafficante family. While the Volstead Act was a social disaster for the nation, it was a massive economic stimulus package for organized crime. Tampa, with its long coastline and proximity to the Caribbean, became a prime hub for rum running. The Trafficante organization, already skilled in logistics and distribution through their Bolita operations, seamlessly expanded into bootlegging. They controlled wharves, bribed customs officials, and managed the flow of illicit alcohol from Cuba and the Bahamas into the thirsty mouths of America. This period supercharged their wealth and, more crucially, their political connections. The scale of this operation required the corruption of police, sheriffs, mayors, and judges. Santo Sr. was a master at this, understanding that a well-placed bribe was more valuable than a dozen hired guns. Young Santo Jr. was a keen observer during these formative years, witnessing firsthand how the underworld and the upper world were not separate spheres, but deeply intertwined. He saw that the law was not a rigid barrier, but a malleable instrument that could be bent by the right application of money and influence. This was a critical insight that would define his entire career. As he grew into his late teens and early 20s, he was given more responsibility within the organization. He was not a frontline enforcer, that was for lesser men. His value was his mind, his calm demeanor, and his unwavering loyalty to his father's methods. He was being groomed. The death of his father in 1954 from natural causes was not a chaotic power struggle as seen in other crime families, it was a seamless transition of power. Santo Trafficante Jr., now 40 years old, had been the de facto leader for some time. He stepped into his father's shoes with the quiet assurance of a crown prince ascending to a throne he had been prepared for his entire life. The Tampa crime family was now his, but his vision was far grander than the Bolita rackets and local vice of Florida. He had his sights set on a jewel just off the coast, a place that was about to become the single most important nexus of money, power, and crime in the Western Hemisphere, the island of Cuba, and its dazzling capital, Havana. Cuba, in the years before Fidel Castro's revolution, was not just a Caribbean island, it was a neon-drenched, vice-fueled paradise for American organized crime, and Santo Trafficante Jr. was one of its principal architects and beneficiaries. While his father had established connections there during the Prohibition era, Santo Jr. saw the island's full potential in the post-war boom. Under the corrupt and compliant regime of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, Havana was transformed into a wide-open city where anything could be had for a price. Batista, effectively in the pocket of the American syndicate, offered lucrative casino licenses, hotel management contracts, and ironclad protection in exchange for a share of the enormous profits. Trafficante, already a respected figure in the underworld due to his Tampa base and his seat on the influential National Commission of the Mafia, moved decisively to secure his piece of this empire. He didn't just visit Havana, he embedded himself there, maintaining a luxurious suite at the Hotel Comodoro and becoming a central figure in the city's shadowy power structure. His domain extended far beyond the gaming tables. He controlled the Sans Souci Cabaret, one of the most glamorous nightclubs in the world, and had a significant interest in the Casino Internacional at the Havana Riviera Hotel, a monument to mob extravagance. But his most crucial holding was his influence over the gambling at the Tropicana Club, a place synonymous with Cuban glamour. Here, under the stars and amidst a whirl of dancers, musicians, and high rollers, Trafficant's power was absolute. He was the silent partner, the unseen manager, the man who ensured the wheels spun, the cards were dealt, and the profits, after the requisite kickbacks to Batista's regime, flowed smoothly north. This was not merely about skimming cash from casino profits, it was a massive, sophisticated money laundering operation. The clean, counted dollars from the casinos could be invested in legitimate businesses back in the United States, or used to fund other criminal enterprises, all while appearing to be revenue from a tropical tourist destination. Trafficant's role in Havana made him a key liaison between the American Mafia and the Cuban political and criminal underworld. He spoke Spanish fluently, understood the culture, and cultivated relationships with everyone from police chiefs and government ministers to powerful local gangsters. This positioned him as the essential middleman, the fixer whom other American mob bosses like Meyer Lansky, Sam Giancana, and the leaders of the New York families had to work through. His calm, businesslike demeanor was his greatest asset in this volatile environment. He was a man of his word in a world of lies, which made him both respected and feared. He managed the complex, often tense, relationships between the various criminal factions vying for a piece of the Cuban pie, preventing the kind of internecine warfare that would attract unwanted attention from the U.S. government. For Trafficante, Havana was the culmination of his father's teachings, a vast, legal-looking enterprise built on a foundation of absolute illegality, protected at the highest levels of a foreign government, and generating wealth on an almost unimaginable scale. It was a perfect, self-sustaining machine, and it seemed it would run forever. But on New Year's Day in 1959, the machine shattered. Fidel Castro and his bearded rebels marched into Havana, and the world that Santo Trafficante Jr. had so carefully built, the empire that was to be his legacy, vanished almost overnight. The casinos were shuttered, the mobsters were expelled, and their assets were confiscated. The paradise was lost, and for Trafficante, the loss was not just financial, it was profoundly personal. He was reportedly briefly imprisoned in the Triscornia detention center during the chaotic early days of the revolution, a humbling experience for a man accustomed to deference and power. This catastrophic event did not break him, but it fundamentally changed him. The disciplined businessman who preferred quiet deals now harbored a deep, simmering vendetta. The loss of Cuba created a rage that would, according to countless investigations and testimonies, eventually place him at the center of one of the most audacious and dangerous plots in American history, a conspiracy that would reach into the highest levels of the U.S. government and forever link his name to the death of a president. The sudden and catastrophic loss of his Cuban empire did not cripple Santo Trafficante Jr., but it fundamentally transformed the trajectory of his criminal career, catapulting him from a regional power broker into a central player on a global stage defined by espionage, assassination plots, and a deep, personal vendetta. Forced to abandon his luxurious suite at the Hotel Comodoro and his lucrative interests in the Tropicana and Sans Souci, Trafficante returned to the United States a different man. The calm, calculating businessman now harbored a cold fury. The Cuban Revolution was not merely a bad business turn, it was a personal insult and a monumental financial disaster, costing him and his associates tens of millions of dollars in present and future revenue. This seething resentment made him a highly motivated and willing asset for a powerful, if unlikely, ally, the Central Intelligence Agency. In the early 1960s, the U.S. government, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower and later John F. Kennedy, was desperate to remove Fidel Castro from power. The CIA's Operation Mongoose was a multifaceted program of sabotage, propaganda, and covert action designed to destabilize and ultimately overthrow the Cuban regime. A key component of this operation, one of its darkest and most controversial, was the exploration of assassinating Castro. It was in this shadowy realm that the interests of the U.S. government and the American Mafia perfectly, and dangerously, aligned. The CIA needed deniable assets with contacts inside Cuba, and the mob, particularly Trafficante, possessed an extensive network of disaffected Cubans who had been part of the pre-revolution casino and vice economy. Furthermore, the mob had the most compelling motive of all, the desire to reclaim their paradise lost. According to later testimony before congressional committees like the Church Committee and the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the CIA, through intermediaries, made contact with Trafficante and his Chicago counterpart, Sam Giancana. The plan was as audacious as it was sordid. The mob would use its resources to orchestrate the murder of a foreign head of state, and the U.S. government would, at the very least, look the other way. Trafficante, leveraging his fluent Spanish and his deep-rooted contacts within the Cuban exile community in Miami, became a key operative in these plots. He was involved in several bizarre and ultimately failed attempts to kill Castro, schemes that sounded like something from a pulp fiction novel. There were plans to poison a milkshake with a botulinum toxin pill, to impregnate a box of Castro's favorite cigars with a lethal chemical, and to rig a seashell with explosives where the Cuban leader was known to snorkel. Trafficante was not a mere bystander, he was an active participant, tasked with passing poison pills to potential assassins inside Cuba. His trusted lieutenant, a Cuban exile named José Alemán, would later testify that Trafficante expressed unwavering confidence in the plots, stating that the mob had already contacted the man who would kill Castro. These operations, for all their elaborate planning, consistently failed, foiled by Castro's formidable security apparatus, sheer luck, or the inherent incompetence of the makeshift alliance between spies and gangsters. For Trafficante, this period was a high-stakes gamble. He was now playing a double game, working with the U.S. government while remaining one of its most wanted criminal targets. This duality required a level of cunning and discretion that few could muster. He never spoke openly of these operations, maintaining his lifelong code of silence, even when it involved matters of international intrigue. The fallout from these failed plots, however, would create a new and even more dangerous set of circumstances. As the Kennedy administration intensified its pressure on Castro, it also, paradoxically, intensified its pressure on organized crime. The president's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, launched an unprecedented crusade against the mob, targeting figures like Trafficante with a zeal that they had never before encountered. From Trafficante's perspective, and that of his associates, they had been recruited by one arm of the government to perform a national service, only to be hunted mercilessly by another. This perceived betrayal bred a venomous hatred, not just for the Castro regime they had failed to kill, but for the Kennedy administration itself. It was in this toxic atmosphere of double-cross and raging fury that a new, even more sinister plot began to take shape, one that would shift the target from Havana to Washington, D.C., and forever entwine the name of Santo Trafficante Jr. with the most traumatic event in modern American history. The toxic convergence of his failed partnership with the CIA and the relentless legal persecution led by Attorney General Robert Kennedy created a cauldron of resentment within Santo Trafficante Jr., a simmering fury that, according to numerous federal investigations and sworn testimonies, may have boiled over into a plot far more devastating than any aimed at Fidel Castro. The narrative of Trafficante's life now enters its most controversial and shadowy chapter, his alleged involvement in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. From the perspective of the American Mafia, the Kennedy administration represented a profound and unforgivable betrayal. They had, by their own understanding, answered a call from their government to eliminate a foreign threat, only to find the full weight of that same government's Justice Department crashing down upon them. Robert Kennedy was not just another attorney general, he was a zealot, personally spearheading raids, pushing for convictions, and making the destruction of organized crime his personal crusade. For Trafficante, a man who had operated with impunity for decades behind a shield of political protection and quiet influence, this new era of scrutiny was intolerable. It threatened not just his freedom, but his entire life's work. It was in this climate of extreme pressure that the idea of removing the source of this pressure, President Kennedy himself, is alleged to have taken root. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, which reinvestigated the Kennedy assassination in the late 1970s, would later conclude that there was a high probability that members of organized crime were involved in a conspiracy to kill the president, and they specifically identified Trafficante as a prime suspect. The circumstantial case, built over years of investigation, is compelling. Key to this was the testimony of a woman named Josephine Brown, Trafficante's longtime mistress. She recounted a chilling story to investigators, alleging that in the autumn of 1963, just weeks before the president's fateful trip to Dallas, Trafficante had spoken to her in a tone of grim prophecy. He told her that President John F. Kennedy was going to be assassinated, a statement that shifted from a prediction to what sounded like insider knowledge as the conversation progressed. This was not a public boast, but a private utterance to a confidant, making it all the more credible to investigators. Even more damning was the testimony of Trafficante's own lawyer, Frank Regano, who years later claimed that in the summer of 1963, he had been used as an unwitting messenger between Trafficante and his New Orleans-based associate, Carlos Marcello. According to Regano, Jimmy Hoffa, the powerful leader of the Teamsters Union who was also under fierce attack from the Kennedys, had explicitly instructed him to carry a message to Trafficante and Marcello, tell them to kill the president. Regano claimed he relayed this shocking directive, and while both mob bosses were initially silent, he later witnessed a meeting where they seemed to be in agreement about a momentous undertaking. Years after the assassination, Regano further alleged that a remorseful Trafficante confessed to him on his deathbed, saying, "We shouldn't have killed Giovanni. We should have killed Bobby." The use of the Italianate, Giovanni, for John, and the specific targeting of the brother he held most responsible, adds a layer of haunting specificity to this deathbed claim. The logistical possibilities are also stark. Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin, had connections to the Cuban exile community in New Orleans, a world that Trafficante knew intimately and manipulated with ease through his bolita and narcotics networks. It would have been well within Trafficante's capabilities to facilitate a patsy, to provide funding, or to arrange for a fall guy through his web of contacts, all while maintaining his signature deniability. He would not have pulled a trigger that was for desperate men like Oswald. His role would have been that of a facilitator, a planner, using his resources and connections to set the stage for a national tragedy while ensuring no concrete evidence led back to him. The assassination in Dallas on November 22, 1963, achieved what the mob wanted. It ended the Kennedy presidency and, critically, it neutered Robert Kennedy's crusade, stripping him of his authority and sending him into a grief-stricken exile from power. For Trafficante, it was the ultimate application of his father's philosophy, an act of immense, world-changing violence executed from the deepest shadows, leaving behind a labyrinth of confusion and mystery that, despite decades of investigation, has never been conclusively solved. He was questioned, he was investigated, but without a smoking gun, the calm, disciplined ghost of the underworld remained, as always, just beyond the reach of the law. The seismic shock of the Kennedy assassination and the ensuing decades of intense scrutiny did not, as one might expect, cripple Santo Trafficante Jr.'s criminal operations. Instead, it demonstrated the profound resilience and deep-rooted nature of his empire, forcing him to adapt and refine his methods for a new era of law enforcement pressure. In the immediate aftermath of November 22, 1963, while the nation reeled and conspiracy theories began to swirl, Trafficante did what he had always done. He retreated into the shadows, maintained his code of silence, and allowed the labyrinthine mystery of Dallas to absorb the attention of the world. He was questioned by federal authorities, of course, but his responses were a masterclass in obfuscation and feigned ignorance. He presented himself as a simple businessman, a Tampa resident with interests in cigar companies and real estate, who was as shocked and appalled by the president's murder as any other American. Without a direct, provable link, the authorities could not hold him. The Warren Commission, in its 1964 report, largely dismissed the possibility of an organized crime conspiracy, focusing instead on the narrative of Oswald as a lone, disaffected gunman. This provided Trafficante with a crucial, if temporary, shield. However, the heat was undeniably on. Robert Kennedy, though devastated and stripped of his power, remained a potent symbol of the threat to the underworld until his own assassination in 1968. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Trafficante was forced to navigate an increasingly complex landscape. The old models of centralized, commission-ruled crime families were being challenged by new federal laws like the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act, which allowed prosecutors to target an entire organization for the crimes of its members. In response, Trafficante further decentralized his own operations. He relied even more heavily on his network of trusted lieutenants, insulating himself through layers of bureaucracy that would make a direct prosecution nearly impossible. He continued to oversee his core territories. The bolita rackets in Tampa and across the southeastern United States remained a cash cow, but he also expanded aggressively into new, more lucrative and less visible ventures. Loan sharking, labor union infiltration, and particularly narcotics trafficking became central pillars of his wealth. While he publicly denied any involvement in the drug trade, the evidence suggests that Trafficante was a major, if carefully insulated, figure in the heroin pipeline from Europe through Cuba and into the United States, leveraging his old Caribbean connections to facilitate the trade. His ability to operate in this realm was a testament to his enduring power. Even as other crime bosses were being indicted and sent to prison, Trafficant's name was often mentioned in connection with massive drug seizures, yet he himself remained untouched. He achieved this through a combination of extreme caution, the ruthless elimination of potential witnesses, and the continued corruption of public officials. Judges, police officers, and local politicians in Florida were still on his payroll, ensuring that he received early warnings of investigations and that key evidence had a tendency to disappear. His personal life was a study in calculated normalcy. He lived not in a gaudy mansion, but in a comfortable, unassuming home in a quiet Tampa neighborhood. He was a family man, known to dote on his children, and he cultivated an image of a respectable, if slightly mysterious, local businessman. This benign public persona was his greatest disguise. He understood that the flamboyant, media-hungry gangster was a doomed gangster. His power was not displayed in gold chains or flashy cars, but in the quiet deference he received when he walked into a restaurant, in the nervous glance of a city official across a room, and in the unshakable loyalty of his soldiers, a loyalty enforced not just by fear, but by the steady, reliable flow of money and protection he provided. This period of his life was a long, slow, strategic retreat from the front lines, a conscious effort to become more of a ghost than ever before. He managed his empire like a corporate CEO, dealing with strategy and high-level disputes while his subordinates handled the day-to-day, and dangerous, street-level operations. He watched as contemporaries like Carmine Galante and others were gunned down or received lengthy prison sentences, and he learned from their mistakes. His survival through the turbulent 1970s, a decade that decimated the ranks of the American Mafia, was not an accident. It was the result of a lifetime of discipline, a philosophy inherited from his father and honed in the fires of Cuba and the aftermath of Dallas. He was playing a long game, and he was winning, but the final act of his life would see him forced to confront his past one last time under the bright, unforgiving lights of a congressional hearing room. The late 1970s marked the final, and very public, challenge to the empire of Santo Trafficante Jr., as the ghosts of his past, from the sun-drenched casinos of Havana to the shadowy plots of the early 1960s, were summoned to testify against him under the stark lights of congressional inquiry. This period of intense national scrutiny began with the formation of the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, better known as the Church Committee, in 1975. This landmark investigation sought to uncover the extent of the U.S. government's illegal activities, including the CIA's assassination plots against foreign leaders. It was here that the secret alliance between the agency and the Mafia was first dragged into the public consciousness. While Trafficante was not called to testify before the Church Committee itself, his name echoed through the hearings, inextricably linked to the bizarre and sordid attempts on Fidel Castro's life. The official reports named him, alongside Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli, as a key participant in these conspiracies, forever cementing his place in the annals of Cold War subterfuge. This public airing of his role as a government-sanctioned would-be assassin, however, was merely a prelude to a far more direct and personal confrontation. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, was established to reinvestigate the murders of both President John F. Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it was before this body that Trafficante was finally compelled to appear. The HSCA had developed significant new information pointing toward a possible conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination, and their focus had sharpened on organized crime. On September 28, 1978, Santo Trafficante Jr., now 63 years old, was sworn in to give a deposition in a closed session in Washington, D.C. The man who entered the room was the picture of a calm, elderly gentleman, dressed in a conservative suit, his demeanor unflappable. For hours, he was questioned by the committee's chief counsel and its members. He faced a barrage of inquiries about his relationships with figures like Carlos Marcello and Johnny Rosselli, about his activities in Cuba, about the CIA plots, and, most critically, about any knowledge he might have had regarding the death of President Kennedy. His performance was a masterclass in evasion and feigned memory loss. He responded to hundreds of questions with a simple, maddening refrain, "I don't remember." He claimed not to remember specific meetings, not to remember the details of his Cuban operations, not to remember conversations with central figures in the investigation. When presented with the testimony of his former lawyer, Frank Regano, about the message from Jimmy Hoffa, Trafficante flatly denied it, dismissing it as a fabrication. When asked about Josephine Brown's claim that he had foreknowledge of the assassination, he similarly denied any recollection of such a conversation. He portrayed himself as a minor figure, a man who had simply managed a few bolita games and cigar shops, who was being unfairly persecuted by sensationalist rumors. He used his age and a carefully cultivated aura of frailty to his advantage, often pausing as if struggling to recall distant, unimportant events. It was the ultimate application of his lifelong strategy: in the face of overwhelming power, do not confront, do not fight, simply become a ghost, a wisp of smoke that cannot be grasped. The committee members grew frustrated, but they could not break him. He never lost his temper, never contradicted himself in a provable way, and never offered anything beyond the barest, most denial-filled testimony. The HSCA, in its final report, stated that it believed organized crime was likely involved in a conspiracy to kill the president, and it specifically identified Trafficante as having the motive, means, and opportunity to have participated. Yet, without a confession or a direct, unassailable witness, they could not indict him. His testimony was a strategic defeat for the committee and a personal victory for the aging mobster. He had faced down the full investigative power of the United States Congress and walked away unscathed, his freedom intact, his secrets still buried. This would be his last major confrontation with the law. He returned to Tampa, his public reputation forever stained by the official findings of the committee, but his physical liberty and his criminal sovereignty remained unbroken. The final years of his life were a quiet coda to a tumultuous career, a slow and steady decline watched from a distance by federal agents who knew that the man they called the "Godfather" of Florida had, once again, slipped through their fingers. The final years of Santo Trafficante Jr. were a testament to the very philosophy that had guided his entire life, a conscious and deliberate retreat from the spotlight, a strategic winding down of overt power, and a masterful maintenance of the ghost-like persona that had allowed him to outlast every rival and survive every investigation. Following his grueling testimony before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978, he returned to Tampa, not as a celebrated kingpin, but as an elder statesman of the underworld, a man whose very survival was his ultimate legend. The intense heat of national scrutiny began to gradually recede, though the watchful eyes of the FBI and other law enforcement agencies never fully turned away. They knew his power remained, but it had become even more ethereal, more deeply embedded in the legitimate-looking structures he had spent decades cultivating. His physical world began to shrink, centering on his unassuming home and a few select social clubs in Ybor City, where he would still hold court, albeit with a smaller, more trusted circle. The day-to-day operations of his vast criminal empire were now largely delegated to a new generation of lieutenants, men who had been groomed with the same emphasis on silence and discretion that he had learned from his father. The empire itself had evolved. While the traditional rackets like bolita and loan sharking continued, the immense profits from narcotics trafficking, particularly heroin and later cocaine, became the financial engine that powered his organization through the 1980s. He was rumored to be a key financier in the pipelines moving drugs from South America and the Caribbean through Florida and into the rest of the United States, using his old, established ports of corruption and his intricate web of contacts to facilitate a trade far more lucrative than the casinos of Havana had ever been. Yet, he was so thoroughly insulated that even as his subordinates were arrested in major drug busts, no direct evidence could be traced back to the old man in Tampa. His health began a slow, inexorable decline. The years of stress, the constant vigilance, and the simple process of aging took their toll. He was diagnosed with heart disease, a condition that required frequent medical attention and slowly sapped his strength. Yet, even from his sickbed, he was said to be in command, receiving reports and issuing directives through a trusted intermediary, his mind remaining sharp and strategic even as his body weakened. He watched the world of organized crime change around him, the old mafia codes of omerta were breaking down, replaced by a new generation of flashier, more volatile drug traffickers who lacked the discipline and long-term vision of his cohort. He saw the rise of figures like John Gotti in New York, whose very public persona and boastful rhetoric were anathema to everything Trafficante stood for. To him, Gotti was a walking, talking liability, a man destined for a fall, and indeed, Gotti's eventual life sentence in federal prison only served to validate Trafficante's lifelong belief in anonymity. His own legal troubles were not entirely over. He faced periodic indictments on charges ranging from tax evasion to conspiracy, but they were like gnats buzzing around a lion, an annoyance, but no real threat. His lawyers, the best that money could buy, successfully fought off these final attempts to imprison him, often on technicalities or through a lack of witnesses willing to testify. The federal government's RICO statutes, so effective against other crime families, seemed to glance harmlessly off the armor of deniability he had spent a lifetime constructing. As the 1980s progressed, he became a living relic, a direct link to a bygone era of American crime, a man who had known Al Capone, conspired with the CIA, and been accused of killing a president. He spent his days in relative quiet, his influence waning not due to law enforcement, but to the simple, undeniable reality of his failing health. The end came on March 17, 1987. Santo Trafficante Jr. died of heart failure at St. Joseph's Hospital in Tampa, Florida. He was 72 years old. His death was not a dramatic, cinematic event. It was a quiet, clinical conclusion in a hospital room. There was no violent end, no rival's bullet, no prison cell. He died a free man, in his own city, surrounded by his family. In death, as in life, he defied the typical narrative of the American gangster. His funeral was a massive, yet deeply private, affair. Hundreds attended, a mix of family, friends, legitimate business associates, and, undoubtedly, the soldiers and captains of his criminal organization. The ceremony was held at a Catholic church, and he was buried in a mausoleum, a final, solid monument to a man who had spent his life as a shadow. The eulogies spoken in public were for the family man, the businessman. The private remembrances, held in the social clubs and back rooms of Ybor City, were for the Godfather. His death created a power vacuum in the Tampa underworld that led to years of instability and violence, a final testament to the powerful, controlling hand he had wielded for so long. In the end, the story of Santo Trafficante Jr. is the story of the criminal who won. He achieved what none of his more famous contemporaries could. He lived a long life, died with his freedom, and passed on a legacy, however tarnished, that remains one of the most complex and enduring puzzles in the history of American organized crime. His life forces us to question the very nature of power, the permeability of the line between government and criminality, and the unsettling reality that sometimes, the most dangerous men are not the ones who make the most noise, but the ones who move in perfect, perpetual silence. The legacy of Santo Trafficante Jr. did not perish with him in that Tampa hospital room. Instead, it fragmented, evolved, and seeped even deeper into the foundations of American criminal enterprise, leaving a blueprint for power that was studied, if never perfectly replicated, by those who came after. The immediate aftermath of his death was a period of violent turmoil within the Tampa crime family, a bloody testament to the sheer force of his personal authority that had, for decades, kept ambitious underlings and rival factions in check. Without the calm, judicial presence of the bold man, the delicate balance of power collapsed. A brutal struggle for succession erupted, pitting his longtime lieutenants against a new, more aggressive generation. This was not the structured, almost corporate transition he had experienced from his father. This was a chaotic and bloody free-for-all, marked by a series of gangland-style murders, disappearances, and betrayals that echoed the darkest days of Prohibition-era Chicago. The very public violence that Trafficante had always abhorred now became the hallmark of his organization, attracting precisely the kind of law enforcement attention he had worked so tirelessly to avoid. The FBI, which had dedicated immense resources to building a case against Trafficante himself, now found its task simplified as the new contenders for his throne turned on each other, providing a wealth of witnesses and evidence that had been unthinkable under his rule. This internal war severely weakened the traditional structure of the Mafia in Florida, but it did not destroy the empire Trafficante had built. It merely forced its components to adapt and mutate. The vast networks he had established, the narcotics pipelines from South America, the money laundering operations through legitimate businesses, the corrupt alliances with port officials and local politicians, were too valuable, too entrenched, to simply vanish. They were absorbed, parceled out, and integrated into a new, more decentralized and international model of organized crime. The cocaine boom of the 1980s was already transforming the criminal landscape, and Florida was its epicenter. The Colombian cartels, possessing unimaginable wealth and a breathtaking capacity for violence, became the new dominant power. Yet, they did not operate in a vacuum. They needed the distribution networks, the logistical support, and the political protection within the United States that pre-existing organizations could provide. The remnants of the Trafficante family, and the individuals he had trained and connected, became crucial junior partners in this new global trade. They were the facilitators, the domestic experts who knew how to move product and money, how to intimidate witnesses, and how to corrupt the system. In this sense, Trafficant's legacy was not a single, inheritable throne, but a virus, a method of operation that infected and influenced the next wave of American criminality. His philosophy of quiet corruption, of embedding criminal enterprises within the legitimate economy, became the standard. The flashy, headline-grabbing gangster was an endangered species. The future belonged to the faceless financiers, the money launderers, the lawyers and accountants who could manipulate the system from within, all lessons that Trafficante had perfected. Furthermore, his story became a permanent, and deeply troubling, footnote in American history. The declassification of documents over the subsequent decades only served to deepen the mystery surrounding his life. Each new file release from the CIA or the FBI provided more tantalizing, if inconclusive, details about his role in the plots to kill Castro and the persistent allegations surrounding the Kennedy assassination. Historians and true crime authors continued to dissect his every move, analyzing his depositions, re-interviewing old associates, and piecing together the puzzle of his influence. He became a central character in the alternative narratives of the Cold War, a symbol of the dark alliance between intelligence agencies and the underworld, a walking embodiment of the concept that the true wheels of power are often turned in shadowy rooms far from the public view. His ability to die of old age, a free man, forces an uncomfortable reckoning with the nature of justice and power in America. It suggests that the most successful criminals are not those who defy the system, but those who learn to co-opt it, to bend its rules and institutions to their will, to become so enmeshed in the fabric of power that they become nearly impossible to extract. The city of Tampa itself bears the subtle, lingering scars and benefits of his reign. The economic influence of his illicit capital, invested in real estate and businesses, shaped the physical growth of the city in ways that are rarely acknowledged. And in the quiet, aging social clubs of Ybor City, where the air still smells faintly of cigars, his name is still spoken with a mixture of fear, respect, and a strange sense of local pride, the ghost of the Godfather, forever watching over the kingdom he built, not with bricks and mortar, but with silence, discipline, and an unwavering understanding of the darkest impulses of human nature. The true measure of Santo Trafficante Jr.'s success, and the aspect that most clearly separates him from the popular caricature of the American gangster, lies not in the wealth he accumulated or the territory he controlled, but in the profound and lingering ambiguity that defines his historical footprint. He mastered the art of strategic ambiguity, ensuring that for every allegation, there was a plausible denial, for every witness, a compromised credibility, and for every piece of circumstantial evidence, a dozen alternative explanations. This was not an accident, but the deliberate outcome of a lifetime of meticulous operation. Consider the most serious accusation against him: complicity in the assassination of a president. The evidence, while compelling, remains a tapestry of whispers and fragments, a deathbed confession to his lawyer, a private prediction to his mistress, his known motive of seething hatred for the Kennedy brothers, and his documented capacity for facilitating complex, deniable crimes. Yet, there is no smoking gun, no signed contract, no definitive audio recording that places him at the center of the plot. He exists in the historical record as a perpetual, maybe, a ghost in the machine of one of America's greatest tragedies. This ambiguity extends to his relationship with the United States government. Official documents confirm his recruitment by the CIA for a mission of national importance, the elimination of Fidel Castro. In one light, this makes him a patriotic asset, a citizen answering the call of his country, however sordid the task. In another, it reveals a stunning hypocrisy at the highest levels of government, a willingness to make a Faustian bargain with the devil himself to achieve a political objective. Trafficante, the cold-eyed realist, would have understood both interpretations and likely found grim amusement in the contradiction. He was simultaneously America's most wanted and America's most useful criminal, a duality that protected him as effectively as any army of bodyguards. Who would aggressively prosecute a man who held, or at least was perceived to hold, the darkest secrets of the national security apparatus? This protective shroud of state secrets and national security classifications, often invoked to keep files locked away for decades, acted as an unintended shield for his own activities. His empire was built on a similar foundation of deliberate obscurity. The rivers of cash that flowed from his narcotics, gambling, and loan sharking operations did not simply vanish into a vault, they were laundered through a complex web of seemingly legitimate businesses, cigar companies, real estate holdings, vending machine operations, and construction firms. This process made his wealth untraceable and, more importantly, presentable. It allowed him to walk into a bank or a courtroom not as a mob boss, but as a successful entrepreneur. He understood that in modern America, financial power was far more potent and far less risky than the overt power of violence. A headline about a major drug seizure was a temporary embarrassment, a well-maintained portfolio of income-generating properties was eternal, silent power. This financial camouflage was so effective that even today, the full extent of his fortune and its pathways into the legitimate economy may never be known. His personal life was the ultimate expression of this principle. He rejected the gaudy displays of wealth and status that doomed so many of his contemporaries. There were no garish mansions, no fleets of exotic cars, no constant entourage of sycophants. He lived a life of calculated moderation, a performance of normalcy designed to deflect attention and suspicion. To his neighbors, he was just another businessman, a family man, a fixture in the community. This was his genius. He made power invisible. He proved that the most formidable criminal is not the one who rules through fear alone, but the one who seamlessly integrates his illicit operations into the daily life of a city, until the two become indistinguishable. The police knew he was a kingpin, the FBI knew he was a kingpin, but proving it in a court of law, beyond the shadow of a doubt, was a challenge that ultimately defeated them all. His story forces us to expand our definition of organized crime beyond the violence of the street and into the quiet, paper-shuffled corners of corporate boardrooms and political backrooms. He was a pioneer in demonstrating that the future of large-scale criminal enterprise lay not in dominating the streets, but in corrupting the systems that were meant to control them. The bloodshed was delegated to subordinates. The real work was done with a handshake, a whispered conversation, and a wire transfer. In the end, the ghost of Santo Trafficante Jr. does not haunt the old crime scenes or the federal courthouses. It haunts our understanding of power itself, suggesting that the most influential figures in any complex society are often the ones whose names are known, but whose true actions remain, forever, shrouded in a silence of their own masterful design. To fully comprehend the enigmatic fortress that was Santo Trafficante Jr.'s life, one must move beyond the specific crimes and conspiracies and examine the intricate, multi-layered defense system he constructed around himself, a system more sophisticated and resilient than any single wall of silence or network of corrupt officials. This defense was not a single entity but a series of concentric circles, each designed to absorb, deflect, or neutralize a different kind of threat. The outermost ring was the vast, sprawling, and decentralized structure of his criminal empire itself. By operating not as a monolithic hierarchy but as a loose confederation of semi-autonomous crews, each managing bolita, narcotics, loan sharking, or union corruption, he ensured that no single law enforcement bust could decapitate the entire organization. An arrest in Miami would not impact the operations in Tampa. A drug seizure at the port would not reveal the intricacies of the gambling syndicate. This cellular structure, reminiscent of a terrorist organization or intelligence agency, meant that very few individuals, even high-ranking captains, possessed a complete picture of the entire operation. This limited the damage any potential informant could cause and created a natural firebreak against the spread of legal scrutiny. The second, and perhaps most crucial, ring was his mastery of the legitimate economy. Trafficante did not just launder money, he weaponized it. His investments in real estate, cigar factories, vending machine companies, and other businesses were not merely passive holdings. They were active tools of influence and protection. A legitimate business provided a plausible source of income, a reason for large cash deposits, and a network of respected citizens, bankers, lawyers, accountants, who, wittingly or unwittingly, became part of his ecosystem. These individuals, often motivated by profit rather than criminal intent, formed a buffer zone of respectability that made it profoundly difficult for prosecutors to paint him as a simple thug. He was not a gangster who dabbled in business, he was a businessman whose enterprises happened to be funded by crime, a subtle but critical distinction in the court of public opinion and, at times, in a court of law. This legitimate facade also provided the perfect cover for communication and meetings. A discussion about a real estate deal in a lawyer's office was far less suspicious than a whispered conversation in a social club. The third ring was his deep and enduring political protection. This went far beyond simply bribing a beat cop or a city councilman. Trafficante's influence was strategic and long-term. He cultivated relationships with figures at the state and even federal level, understanding that true protection came from the top down. These relationships were not always crude cash transactions, they were often built on mutual back-scratching, campaign contributions, favors, the delivery of votes from certain unions or communities, or the suppression of embarrassing information. This created a powerful constituency with a vested interest in his continued freedom. A sheriff on his payroll could derail a local investigation, a friendly judge could throw out a case on a technicality, a state senator could apply pressure to redirect law enforcement resources elsewhere. This political shield ensured that many potential investigations were stillborn, never gaining the momentum or resources needed to reach his inner circle. The fourth, and most impenetrable, ring was his personal demeanor, the discipline of the ghost. In a world populated by volatile, egotistical, and often reckless men, Trafficante's calm, quiet, and consistent persona was his greatest weapon. He never boasted, never gave interviews, never lost his temper in public, and never drew unnecessary attention to himself. This discipline extended to his personal habits. He was not a heavy drinker, nor was he known for drug use or flashy womanizing. He presented himself as a sober, serious, and reliable figure, which made him a more credible denier in the eyes of a jury and a more trustworthy partner in the eyes of his criminal and political allies. This aura of calm authority also commanded a deeper loyalty from his subordinates. They feared him, certainly, but they also respected his judgment and his ability to navigate crises without panic. This final, personal ring is what truly bound the others together. A decentralized empire could have fractured without a central, respected authority. Legitimate businesses could have been exposed without the discipline to maintain the facade. Political protection could have evaporated if he had become a public liability. Santo Trafficante Jr.'s genius was in synchronizing all these defensive layers into a single, harmonious system, where his personal code of silence and anonymity reinforced the structural insulations of his organization, which in turn protected the political relationships that gave him the space to operate. He was not just a criminal, he was the chief executive, legal counsel, and public relations director for his own life, a one-man institution whose ultimate product was not crime, but impunity. Understanding this intricate defense system is essential because it explains the frustration of law enforcement and the fascination of historians. They were not chasing a man, they were besieging a fortress, one whose blueprints were known, but whose foundations proved, again and again, to be unshakable. The shadow of Santo Trafficante Jr. stretches far beyond the confines of Tampa and the annals of organized crime, casting a long, dark silhouette across the broader canvas of 20th-century American history, forcing a reckoning with the uncomfortable ways in which criminal enterprise, government policy, and national destiny can become tragically intertwined. His story is a critical, if often overlooked, thread in the tapestry of the Cold War, a narrative that challenges the simplistic dichotomy of a free world versus a communist bloc. Through his pivotal role in the CIA-Mafia plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, Trafficante became an active, if deniable, participant in American foreign policy. This alliance was not an anomaly but a symptom of a deeper moral compromise, a moment where the nation's intelligence apparatus willingly clasped hands with the underworld in pursuit of a geopolitical objective. The consequences of this pact were catastrophic and reverberate through history. One can draw a direct, if complex, line from those poisoned cigars and botulinum-laced milkshakes in Havana to the grassy knoll in Dallas. The HSCA's finding of a likely conspiracy in the assassination of President Kennedy is inextricably linked to the motive forged in the white-hot fury of the mob's betrayal by the Kennedy administration, a betrayal born from the very fact that the government had first approached them for murder. Trafficante, the quiet don from Florida, thus found himself at the nexus of two of the most profound political tragedies of the era, the loss of Cuba to communism and the murder of an American president. His life demonstrates that the underworld was not a separate, subaltern layer of society, but a parallel power structure, one that could, at times, intersect with and dramatically alter the course of the upper world. Furthermore, his enduring business in narcotics trafficking places him at the origins of a national crisis that would explode in the decades following his death. The heroin pipelines he helped establish and manage through his Caribbean connections were the precursors to the cocaine glut of the 1980s, which would devastate American cities and lead to mass incarceration on an unprecedented scale. While he operated, the drug trade was a sophisticated, high-profit business for a select criminal few. The societal wreckage it would cause was a distant, unconsidered externality. In this, he was a pioneer of a form of globalized crime that would later be perfected by the Colombian cartels and Mexican trafficking organizations, a model built on international logistics, corruption, and a ruthless focus on profit over any human cost. His ability to launder massive sums of money also prefigured the modern era of global finance, where illicit capital flows through the world's banking systems, often undetected and unopposed. He understood earlier than most that in the modern world, financial infrastructure could be as critical to criminal success as a loyal crew of enforcers. On a societal level, his reign over Tampa offers a case study in the systemic corruption that can take root when criminal power is allowed to mature and embed itself over generations. His was not a sudden, violent takeover, but a slow, patient grafting of his organization onto the city's political and economic body. This created a culture of complicity and fear that lingered long after his death, making true reform a monumental challenge. The story of Santo Trafficante Jr. is therefore not a period piece, it is a foundational story for understanding contemporary America. It forces us to question the official narratives of our history, to look for the hidden connections and the silenced voices. It suggests that the forces that truly shape our world are not always visible on the evening news or in the pages of the newspaper, but operate in the quiet spaces between, in the unrecorded meeting, the ambiguous transaction, and the unspoken understanding. His legacy is the lingering doubt, the persistent question mark that hangs over some of our nation's most profound tragedies. He is the ghost in the American machine, a reminder that the pursuit of power, whether by nations or by individuals, often leads down a dark and twisted path, one from which it is sometimes impossible to return. To study his life is to lift a rock and examine the complex, and often unsettling, ecosystem that thrives just beneath the surface of our everyday reality, an ecosystem where the lines between crime and government, between justice and power, are not just blurred, but are often erased completely. To truly grasp the operational genius of Santo Trafficante Jr., one must dissect the cold, calculating business acumen that underpinned every facet of his criminal empire, for he was, above all else, a master executive who understood that profit, not notoriety, was the ultimate measure of success. He approached syndicated crime with the disciplined mind of a Fortune 500 CEO, and his organization functioned with an efficiency that would be the envy of any legitimate corporation. At the most fundamental level, his enterprise was a study in vertical and horizontal integration. He controlled the bolita rackets from the street-level numbers writers all the way up to the bankers who held the cash, ensuring that every penny of profit was captured within his organization. This same principle was applied to his narcotics operations, where he sought to influence the supply chain from the point of importation through to the street-level distribution, eliminating middlemen wherever possible to maximize margins. His foray into the Cuban casino industry was the ultimate expression of this. He wasn't just skimming from the tables, he was often a part owner of the very hotels that housed the casinos, profiting from the rooms, the restaurants, and the entertainment, thereby laundering his illicit gaming revenue through a cascade of seemingly legitimate income streams. Risk management was a cornerstone of his philosophy. Unlike the bank robbers of the Depression era or the brash drug lords of the 1980s, Trafficante abhorred high-risk, high-profile scores. His preferred business model was a portfolio of steady, recurring revenue streams, the bolita, the jukeboxes and vending machines, the loan sharking, that generated reliable cash flow with minimal exposure. The narcotics trade, while immensely profitable, was his high-risk venture capital arm, and he insulated himself from its inherent dangers through his sophisticated corporate structure. He was a pioneer in understanding and exploiting the concept of jurisdictional arbitrage. By basing his core operations in Tampa, a city with a long history of political corruption and a more provincial law enforcement focus, he avoided the intense, constant scrutiny that mobsters in New York or Chicago faced from the federal government. He could then extend his operations into other, more lucrative territories, using his Tampa base as a secure headquarters. His international expansion into Cuba was the most brilliant application of this strategy, moving his most profitable and potentially legally problematic operations to a sovereign nation where he enjoyed official protection from the head of state. This was not a gangster on the run, this was a corporate conglomerate offshoring its manufacturing to a country with favorable tax and labor laws. His approach to violence was equally corporate, it was a tool of business, never of passion. Violence was used strategically to enforce contracts, eliminate competition, or discipline insubordination. It was deployed surgically, with specific objectives, and was almost always carried out by subordinates, creating layers of deniability between the order and the act. This was in stark contrast to the chaotic, emotional violence that often characterized other crime families and which inevitably led to internal wars and federal crackdowns. Trafficant's most valuable asset was his reputation for calm, predictable, and ruthless rationality, which often made the actual use of violence unnecessary. The mere knowledge of his capability was enough to ensure compliance from rivals and underlings alike. He was also a master of financial management, understanding that wealth was useless if it couldn't be spent or invested without attracting attention. His money laundering operations were years ahead of their time, involving a complex web of cash-intensive front businesses, complicit bankers, and international shell companies. He reinvested his illicit profits into the legitimate economy, building a portfolio of real estate and other assets that not only cleaned his money but also generated more clean money, creating a virtuous cycle that further cemented his power and respectability. This financial sophistication meant that even when law enforcement knew the source of his wealth, tracing it and proving it in court was a Herculean task. In essence, Santo Trafficante Jr. did not just run a crime family, he ran a multinational, diversified holding company whose product was illicit services and whose competitive advantage was corruption and intimidation. He was a visionary who saw the future of organized crime not as a street-level battle for turf, but as a balance sheet-driven enterprise that thrived on efficiency, strategic planning, and the systematic corruption of the legal and political systems designed to contain it. His long career stands as a dark testament to the fact that in the world of crime, as in the world of business, the most dangerous predator is not the loudest or the most violent, but the smartest, the most patient, and the one who best understands the system he seeks to exploit. The human cost of Santo Trafficante Jr.'s meticulously managed empire, the shattered lives and silenced voices that formed the dark foundation of his wealth and power, represents the most damning and often overlooked chapter of his legacy. While he projected an image of a calm businessman, his reign was ultimately enforced by a pervasive and ever-present threat of violence that coursed like a hidden current through the sun-baked streets of Tampa and the vibrant nightlife of Havana. The discipline he was so famous for was not maintained through gentle persuasion. It was upheld by a network of enforcers whose very existence was a message to anyone who might consider betraying the organization or failing to pay a debt. The bodies of those who crossed him, or were perceived to have crossed him, were found in remote swamps, weighted down in the murky waters of the Gulf of Mexico, or left in cars as a grim warning to others. These were not just rival gangsters, they were often small-time operators, indebted gamblers, or even his own men who had made a fatal error in judgment. Each disappearance, each unsolved murder, added another layer of fear that cemented his control, a chilling reminder that the quiet man in the nice suit was capable of authorizing absolute brutality without a second thought. Beyond the direct violence was the insidious societal damage wrought by his core businesses. The bolita rackets, while often romanticized as a harmless numbers game, preyed upon the hopes of the poor and working class in Ybor City and beyond, siphoning away meager wages with the false promise of a life-changing win. His loan-sharking operations trapped individuals in cycles of debt from which there was often no escape, the vig, or interest, compounding so rapidly that borrowers became virtual slaves to the organization, forced to commit other crimes or surrender their assets to service the impossible debt. But the most devastating impact, on a national scale, came from his deep involvement in narcotics. As a key financier and logistical facilitator in the heroin trade, Trafficante was instrumental in flooding American cities with a highly addictive substance that would ravage communities for generations. The addiction, the overdose deaths, the property crimes committed by users desperate for a fix, the collapse of families, this was the human wreckage left in the wake of his profit-seeking. He never saw this carnage. He dealt in kilos and cash, insulated from the human suffering his business caused by layers of subordinates. In Cuba, the glittering casino empire he helped build was a monument to exploitation. While American tourists enjoyed the shows and the gaming tables, the profits were built on a foundation of political corruption and the systematic skimming that robbed the Cuban people of revenue that could have been used for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. His presence, and that of his mafia associates, contributed to the profound social inequality and moral decay that fueled the resentment Fidel Castro would so effectively harness during his revolution. The very corruption that made Havana a paradise for the mob also made it a tinderbox for political upheaval. And then there were the personal betrayals, the destruction of trust that is the hallmark of any criminal enterprise built on omerta. Lives were lived in constant suspicion. Friendships were transactional. Families were left to mourn sons and fathers who vanished without a trace, their fates forever unknown, their grief compounded by the silence imposed by the Trafficante organization. The code of silence was not a noble tradition, it was a tool of oppression, a mechanism that prevented justice and healing for the victims and their loved ones. For every dollar that was laundered through a legitimate business, there was a story of a life ruined by addiction or a family destroyed by violence. For every politician who was bribed, there was an erosion of public trust in democratic institutions. Santo Trafficante Jr. died in his bed, a free man, but his freedom was purchased with a currency of fear, addiction, and blood. The quiet efficiency of his criminal corporation should not obscure the profound and lasting damage it inflicted upon thousands of individuals and the very fabric of the societies in which it operated. The ghost of his empire, therefore, is not just a story of one man's cleverness, but a haunting reminder of the collective price paid for his power, a debt that was settled not by him, but by the countless anonymous souls whose suffering was the true cost of doing business. The final, and perhaps most perplexing, chapter in the saga of Santo Trafficante Jr. concerns not his life, but his death, and the enduring silence that followed, a silence so profound it became his last, and most powerful, strategic move. When he drew his last breath in that sterile hospital room on March 17, 1987, he did not take his secrets with him in a dramatic, cinematic confession. Instead, he entrusted them to the void, ensuring that the full truth of his actions would remain a subject of fierce debate and speculation for decades to come. His death from heart failure was, like his life, devoid of the violent finality that befell so many of his peers. There was no gangland hit, no prison sentence, no dramatic last stand. It was an almost mundane end for a man who had navigated the most extraordinary of circumstances, a final demonstration of his unique brand of control. In the immediate aftermath, the world watched to see what would happen next. Would a hidden diary be discovered? Would a trusted confidant finally come forward with a deathbed revelation that would solve the great mysteries of the Cold War? The answer was a resounding, and for investigators and historians, a deeply frustrating, silence. His home and offices yielded no trove of incriminating documents, no meticulously kept ledgers detailing payments to politicians or records of the CIA plots. He had operated for too long and too wisely to leave such a straightforward trail. The silence extended to his inner circle. The code of Omerta, which he had enforced with a blend of loyalty and terror, held strong even after his passing. Those who had known the innermost workings of his empire, who could have shed light on the Kennedy assassination allegations or the intricate details of the narcotics networks, remained quiet. Some out of lingering fear, others out of a twisted sense of honor, and many more because the decentralized structure of his organization meant that no single underling possessed the complete picture. The silence was also enforced by the simple, chilling effectiveness of his earlier actions. Potential witnesses who might have spoken after his death had already been eliminated during his life. The funeral itself was a spectacle of this duality, a public display of mourning for the respected community figure, and a private gathering of the criminal underworld paying homage to the departed godfather. But no eulogy, public or private, revealed the truths that the FBI and congressional committees had spent millions of dollars and decades trying to uncover. In the years that followed, the slow declassification of government documents provided pieces of the puzzle, but never the complete picture. Each released file from the CIA or the FBI offered tantalizing glimpses, a memo mentioning his name in connection with a Castro plot, a surveillance log placing him in a meeting with a known conspirator, but these were fragments, open to interpretation. They confirmed his presence in the room during history's dark moments, but they failed to capture his exact words, his specific instructions, his ultimate intentions. This has allowed his legacy to remain malleable. To some, he is a criminal mastermind who got away with treason and murder. To others, he is a convenient scapegoat, a shadowy figure upon whom it is easy to project the nation's unresolved grief and suspicion over the Kennedy assassination. The ambiguity was his final gift to his own myth and his final curse on the historical record. He understood that a mystery is far more powerful and enduring than a solved case. A closed file invites finality, an open question demands perpetual investigation, endless books, and countless documentaries. By dying without confession or conviction, he ensured that his name would never be relegated to a simple, closed entry in the annals of crime. He remains an active subject, a ghost that still haunts the American imagination. The silence he cultivated is now filled with the echoes of our own questions, a conversation that he continues to control from beyond the grave. In this, he achieved a form of immortality, forever the calm, inscrutable figure at the center of a storm of his own making, a man whose greatest secret may not have been what he did, but the fact that he managed to leave the world forever wondering, and never truly knowing. The city of Tampa itself serves as the silent, enduring monument to Santo Trafficante Jr., a living archive where his influence, though faded, is still subtly etched into the very brick and mortar of its neighborhoods and the complex relationship its citizens have with their own history. To walk through the streets of Ybor City today is to navigate a landscape of ghosts, where the vibrant, bustling center of the cigar industry and the Trafficante Bolita empire has been largely transformed into a district of restaurants, boutiques, and nightlife catering to tourists. The social clubs where deals were struck and loyalties were sworn still stand, some preserved as historical landmarks, their past sanitized for public consumption. The whispers of the old world are there for those who know how to listen, in the architecture of the old El Centro Español building, in the quiet, knowing look of a lifelong resident, in the stories passed down through families who remember a time when the name Trafficante commanded a different kind of respect, one mingled with fear. The city's development, particularly in the mid-20th century, was undeniably shaped by the flow of illicit capital from his organization. Real estate transactions, construction projects, and the rise of certain local businesses can often be traced back, through a convoluted and carefully obscured paper trail, to the fortunes amassed from gambling, narcotics, and loan sharking. This created a paradoxical legacy. The criminal enterprise that preyed upon the community also, in a perverse way, helped build parts of it, investing in the physical city even as it corroded its social and political institutions. This duality has fostered a deeply ambivalent memory of the man within Tampa. There is no public statue of Santo Trafficante Jr., no official celebration of his life. The city's establishment, understandably, prefers to focus on a future untethered from its notorious past. Yet, beneath the surface, a certain mythology persists. In some quarters, he is remembered not as a vicious mobster, but as a kind of dark folk hero, a local boy who made good on an unimaginable scale, who outsmarted the federal government, and who, in his own way, put Tampa on the map in the national consciousness. This romanticized view conveniently overlooks the addiction, the violence, and the corruption, instead focusing on the narrative of a shrewd, self-made man who operated by his own code. This cultural memory is a form of historical bargaining, a way for a city to reconcile itself with a past it cannot change and a figure it cannot fully disown. For the older generation, his name evokes a specific era, a time when the city had a different rhythm, when certain things were understood without being said, and when a singular, unseen power provided a strange, unsettling form of order. For newer residents, he is a figure of lore, a character from a movie or a true crime podcast, his story divorced from the tangible reality of the community they now call home. The law enforcement community in Tampa, past and present, views his legacy with a mixture of professional frustration and cold respect. The detectives and FBI agents who spent their careers trying to build a case against him came to admire, grudgingly, the sheer brilliance of his operational security. He became the one that got away, the benchmark against which all other criminal targets were measured. His story is taught in law enforcement academies not as a how-to guide, but as a masterclass in the methodologies that must be understood and overcome. He is the ghost they are still chasing, the reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who most closely resemble pillars of the community. The physical Tampa of today, the gleaming skyscrapers, the revitalized river walk, the bustling airport, belies its shadowy history, but the foundation upon which much of this modern progress was built is, in part, a foundation of illicit cash that was laundered into legitimacy. The story of Santo Trafficante Jr. and Tampa is therefore a story of symbiosis, an uncomfortable and unacknowledged partnership between a city and its shadow. It is a relationship built on silence, on winks and nods, on the understanding that some truths are too messy for public display. The city has moved on, as it must, but it carries the genetic imprint of his empire in its streets, in its economy, and in the collective memory of its people, a permanent, quiet reminder that history is not always written in the official records, but is often buried in the unspoken agreements and the hidden transactions that truly shape a place. The figure of Santo Trafficante Jr. inevitably invites comparison to his more notorious contemporaries in the American Mafia, and it is in this contrast that the unique contours of his power and philosophy come into sharpest focus, revealing a model of criminal enterprise that was, in many ways, far more sophisticated and durable than the models that captured the public's imagination. Where Al Capone of Chicago was a blustering, violent showman whose reign was defined by the very public St. Valentine's Day massacre and ended in a tax evasion conviction, Trafficante was a silent strategist whose most devastating acts were designed to be untraceable. Capone built his empire on fear and spectacle, Trafficante built his on silence and integration. Where New York's John Gotti, the Dapper Don, courted the media, held press conferences on the steps of his courthouse, and reveled in his Teflon reputation, Trafficante would have viewed such behavior as suicidal insanity. Gotti's flamboyance was a direct repudiation of everything the Ghost Don stood for, and it ultimately led Gotti to die in a federal prison, a starkly different finale from Trafficante's quiet death in his own bed. The comparison highlights a fundamental divide in the underworld, the path of the celebrity gangster, which is bright, brief, and ends in ruin, versus the path of the phantom, which is long, shadowy, and ends in freedom. Similarly, while Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was a visionary who saw the potential of Las Vegas, he was also volatile, emotionally invested, and ultimately murdered in a dispute over money, his body riddled with bullets. Trafficante, who had helped build an even more lavish and corrupt casino paradise in Havana, maintained a dispassionate, corporate distance. He was an investor and an operator, not a dreamer, and his calm demeanor prevented the kind of personal conflicts that doomed Siegel. Another key distinction lies in their relationship with law enforcement. While most major crime figures accumulated lengthy rap sheets and spent significant portions of their lives in and out of courtrooms and prisons, Trafficant's criminal record was remarkably sparse. He was arrested, of course, but convictions were rare, and significant prison time was non-existent. This was not luck, it was the direct result of his multi-layered defense system of political protection, legal insulation, and witness intimidation, which was far more effective than the brute force approaches of others. His seat on the National Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, was also wielded differently. While figures like Vito Genovese of New York sought power for its own sake, engaging in bloody wars for titular control, Trafficant's influence on the commission was that of a respected banker and a strategic advisor. His power base in Florida, with its international ports and proximity to Cuba, gave him a unique and critical role that transcended mere territorial squabbles. He was the commission's ambassador to the Caribbean, its connection to the lucrative narcotics trade, and its liaison with corrupt foreign governments. This gave him a stature that was independent of the size of his hometown. He was a national power broker precisely because his domain was not confined to a single city. Perhaps the most telling comparison is with his own father. Santo Trafficante Jr. was a formidable and respected boss in his own right, but his world was largely regional, centered on Tampa and its bolita rackets. The son took his father's core principles, discipline, silence, corruption, and applied them on a global canvas. He was the one who leveraged Prohibition-era rum-running contacts into a casino empire in a foreign country. He was the one who parlayed his Cuban exile network into a partnership with the Central Intelligence Agency. He was the one whose alleged reach extended to the assassination of a president. He took a successful local criminal operation and transformed it into a transnational corporation, with interests in gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, and political manipulation. In doing so, he did not just succeed his father, he transcended him, creating a legacy that was far grander, more complex, and more deeply entangled with the mainstream of American history. The story of these comparisons is not merely a ranking of gangsters, but an analysis of criminal strategy. It demonstrates that in the Darwinian world of organized crime, the traits that ensure long-term survival and success are not brute strength or flamboyant charisma, but patience, intelligence, and an almost preternatural ability to remain invisible while pulling the levers of power. Santo Trafficante Jr. was, by these measures, the most evolutionarily advanced of his kind, a predator who learned to thrive not by fighting the environment, but by perfectly camouflaging himself within it. The enduring fascination with Santo Trafficante Jr. speaks to something deeper than a mere interest in true crime. It taps into fundamental questions about the American experience, the nature of power, and the unsettling possibility that the official narrative of history is but a carefully edited version of a far more complex and darker truth. He exists in the public imagination as a permanent question mark, a human Rorschach test onto which we project our own suspicions about how the world truly works. For those who believe that the assassination of President Kennedy was the product of a conspiracy, Trafficante is an essential and plausible architect, a figure with the motive, means, and cold-blooded disposition to have orchestrated the crime of the century. He represents the terrifying idea that the political process can be violently hijacked by unseen criminal forces, that a single, disciplined man operating from the shadows could alter the course of a nation. This transforms him from a mere gangster into a figure of profound historical consequence, a player on the world stage who manipulated the strings of geopolitics for his own ends. His story challenges the comforting myth of American exceptionalism, forcing us to confront the fact that the same country that presented itself as the leader of the free world during the Cold War was also a place where a crime boss could be recruited by its premier intelligence agency to conduct illegal assassinations. This duality, this hidden partnership between the highest and lowest elements of society, is a deeply unsettling concept, and Trafficante is its perfect symbol. He forces us to re-examine the very definitions of patriotism and treason, of public service and criminal enterprise. Furthermore, his life is a dark mirror of the American dream. He was the son of immigrants who achieved immense wealth and power, but he did so by perverting the very system that promised opportunity. His story is a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of ambition and the fragility of the social contract when faced with the corrosive power of organized, illicit wealth. He demonstrated that the tools of capitalism, incorporation, investment, market control, could be just as effectively wielded in the service of crime as in the service of commerce, blurring the line between the businessman and the mobster until they became indistinguishable. For students of history, he is a pivotal figure in understanding the covert history of the Cold War, a tangible link between the gangland violence of Prohibition and the global shadow wars between superpowers. For students of criminology, he is the ultimate case study in the evolution of organized crime from street-level thuggery to a sophisticated, corporate-style enterprise. His ability to operate for nearly 7 decades without spending a single day in a federal prison is not just a personal triumph of evasion, it is an indictment of the justice system's inability to combat a criminal who fully understands and systematically exploits its weaknesses. The mystery that surrounds him is not a vacuum of information, but a dense fog of conflicting accounts, partial truths, and deliberate obfuscation. This lack of closure is what keeps his story alive. We are drawn to puzzles, and the life of Santo Trafficante Jr. is one of the most intricate and consequential puzzles of the 20th century. Every declassified document, every aging witness who comes forward, every new book on the Kennedy assassination, offers the potential for a breakthrough, the chance to finally solve the riddle. But that solution may never come, and perhaps that is the way he intended it. In the end, our fascination with the Ghost Dawn is a fascination with the limits of our own knowledge. He is a permanent reminder that behind the clear, orderly story we tell ourselves about the past, there lurks a shadow history, more ambiguous and far more frightening, a history written not in speeches and legislation, but in silent partnerships, buried bodies, and secrets taken to the grave. To study him is to stare into that darkness, and to wonder, with a chilling uncertainty, what other truths remain hidden there. The operational tactics and strategic foresight employed by Santo Trafficante Jr. offer a chillingly effective blueprint for modern criminal enterprises, demonstrating a prescient understanding of globalization, corporate structuring, and information security that would not become standard in the legitimate business world for decades. His model, refined over a lifetime of illicit success, has proven to be remarkably exportable and adaptable, providing a foundational playbook for the transnational criminal organizations that dominate the 21st century. Consider his approach to geography and jurisdiction. Long before the term globalization entered the common lexicon, Trafficante was operating a truly international business. He used Tampa as a secure, manageable headquarters, a place where he could corrupt the local political and law enforcement infrastructure to create a safe haven. He then extended his operations into higher-risk, higher-reward markets like Cuba, effectively offshoring his most sensitive activities to a jurisdiction where he enjoyed state-level protection. This is precisely the model used by modern cybercriminals who base their operations in countries with lax extradition laws while targeting victims in wealthier nations. His supply chain for narcotics was a masterpiece of logistical planning, establishing resilient pipelines from Europe and later South America through the Caribbean, using his control over port officials and his network of maritime contacts to move product with an efficiency that rivaled any legitimate import-export business. This modular, international structure made his entire operation virtually invulnerable to a single law enforcement strike. Taking down one segment of the pipeline in Miami did nothing to disrupt the source in Sicily or the distribution network in New York. Furthermore, his corporate-style organizational chart was a work of dark genius. By decentralizing his empire into distinct, semi-autonomous divisions, gambling, narcotics, loan sharking, labor racketeering, he created built-in operational security. A captain in the Bolita operation knew little about the inner workings of the heroin trade, and vice versa. This limited the damage any single informant could cause and prevented the kind of comprehensive RICO case that would eventually bring down more centralized crime families. This cellular structure is now a hallmark of every major criminal and terrorist organization in the world, from Mexican cartels to jihadist networks, because it is fundamentally the most secure way to organize a large, illegal enterprise. His financial operations were equally forward-thinking. He did not just hide money, he laundered it through a cascading series of legitimate and cash-intensive businesses, reinvesting the cleaned profits to generate more clean capital and gain societal influence. This process of layering and integration is the cornerstone of modern money laundering, now conducted on a digital, global scale through shell companies, cryptocurrency, and international trade finance. Trafficante understood that the ultimate goal was not to possess wealth, but to be able to use it openly and without suspicion, a concept that every major drug cartel and corruption syndicate has since embraced. Perhaps his most impactful innovation was his philosophy of personal branding, or more accurately, the lack thereof. In an age before digital surveillance and facial recognition, he nonetheless grasped the fundamental principle that the most dangerous exposure is not being caught in the act, but being known to the authorities and the public as the man in charge. His cultivation of the ghost persona, the quiet, unassuming businessman who never raised his voice, never drew attention, and never took credit, was a strategic masterstroke. While his contemporaries became celebrities and targets, he remained a rumor, a suspicion, a name in a file, but never a face on the evening news. This low profile provided him with the one thing more valuable than any amount of money: time. It gave him the time to build his empire, to forge his political alliances, and to outwait and outlast his pursuers. The lesson has been absorbed by the most successful criminals of the current era. The leaders of the most powerful Mexican cartels, for example, are often shadows, their photographs rare and outdated, their power exercised entirely through intermediaries. Santo Trafficante Jr. was, in essence, a criminal futurist. He looked at the evolving American landscape of the mid-20th century, its growing federal power, its global reach, its complex financial systems, and did not see threats, but opportunities. He adapted the old-world traditions of the Sicilian Mafia and fused them with a modern, corporate, and globalized vision. The result was a criminal prototype that was perfectly engineered for longevity and profit in the modern world. His legacy, therefore, is not confined to the history books. It lives on in the operational manuals of every sophisticated criminal organization that has learned, directly or indirectly, from the ghost of Tampa. The psychological portrait of Santo Trafficante Jr. is as complex and layered as the criminal empire he built, a fascinating study in contrasts that reveals a man whose inner world was likely defined by a profound separation between his personal affections and his professional ruthlessness, a deep-seated paranoia that was both a liability and a survival tool, and an intellectual arrogance that allowed him to believe he could outthink every system designed to contain him. To the outside world, and even to his immediate family, he presented himself as a calm, devoted patriarch, a man who valued the simple pleasures of home life and the respect of his community. This was not necessarily a calculated lie. It is entirely possible that he compartmentalized his existence so completely that the man who ordered a murder over a disputed gambling debt and the man who read bedtime stories to his children were, in his own mind, two distinct individuals. This ability to bifurcate his morality was his psychological superpower. It allowed him to engage in acts of extreme violence and corruption without the crippling guilt or emotional volatility that undid so many of his peers. He could authorize the disappearance of a business partner in the afternoon and then sit down to a peaceful family dinner in the evening, the two acts existing in separate, airtight compartments of his consciousness. This detachment was the key to his legendary calmness. He wasn't suppressing rage or fear, he was simply accessing a different part of himself, the dispassionate executive for whom violence was a simple matter of cost-benefit analysis. Underpinning this entire existence was a constant, low-grade hum of paranoia, a necessary and rational state for a man in his position. He trusted very few people completely, and even those relationships were contingent on constant demonstrations of loyalty and utility. This paranoia bred an operational caution that became his trademark. He assumed his phones were tapped, his homes were bugged, and his movements were watched, because they often were. This turned him into a ghost not by choice, but by necessity. His entire life became a performance for an unseen audience of federal agents, and he mastered the role of the innocent businessman so thoroughly that the line between performance and reality may have eventually blurred even for him. Yet, this paranoia was balanced by a towering, almost unshakable, arrogance. This was not the loud, boastful arrogance of a John Gotti, but a quiet, internalized conviction of his own intellectual superiority. He genuinely believed he was smarter than the police, smarter than the FBI agents, smarter than the senators who questioned him. This arrogance is what allowed him to take the audacious step of working with the CIA. He believed he could manipulate the world's most powerful intelligence agency for his own ends, and to a certain extent, he did. It is also what may have led him to consider, if the allegations are true, the ultimate crime of assassinating a president. This was not just an act of revenge, it was an act of supreme arrogance, a belief that he could strike at the heart of the American political system and manage the aftermath, remaining hidden in the ensuing storm. His behavior during his HSCA testimony is a perfect illustration of this trait. His repeated claims of, "I don't remember," were not just a legal strategy, they were a subtle form of contempt, a way of demonstrating to his powerful interrogators that their process, their authority, could not touch him. He was playing a game of intellectual chess with the United States Congress, and his calm, repeated denials were his way of saying, "Checkmate." This blend of compartmentalization, paranoia, and arrogance created a personality that was perfectly suited for long-term survival in the underworld. He lacked the reckless passions that created vulnerabilities. He was never motivated by a desire for public fame or a need to be feared for its own sake. His driving force was control, over his business, over his environment, and over his own destiny. The wealth was not the end goal, but merely the scorecard in his lifelong game of chess. The power was not for glorification, but for the security and autonomy it provided. He wanted to be the unseen hand that moved the pieces, and in this, he succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of any other American crime figure. To understand the mind of Santo Trafficante Jr. is to understand that the most successful criminal is not a monster devoid of humanity, but a man who has mastered the art of dividing his humanity, walling off the dark and light parts of his soul so that each can operate independently, allowing him to be both a loving father and a ruthless kingpin, a pillar of his community and a phantom in the machinery of American power. The role of women in the life of Santo Trafficante Jr. provides a poignant and often overlooked window into the confines of his carefully constructed world, revealing the inescapable human toll of a life lived in the shadows, even for those who were not direct participants in his criminal endeavors. His wife, Josephine, and his daughters, along with his long-term mistress, Josephine Brown, existed in a gilded cage, beneficiaries of the immense wealth his empire generated, yet perpetually confined by the silence, suspicion, and ever-present danger that were its foundation. They enjoyed the material comforts that few could imagine, beautiful homes, the finest clothing, a life free from financial worry. But this comfort came at a steep and unspoken price. Their lives were circumscribed by the need for absolute discretion. Friendships were likely scrutinized, social engagements were carefully vetted, and casual conversations were always tempered by the knowledge that any slip of the tongue could have devastating consequences. They lived with the constant, low-grade anxiety of knowing that the man they loved as a husband and father was also a target for rival gangs, ambitious underlings, and the full force of the federal government. The sound of a car backfiring, a late-night phone call, or an unexpected knock at the door could trigger a surge of fear that was the hidden tax on their luxurious lifestyle. For his wife, Josephine, her role was that of the traditional, loyal spouse, a pillar of the family unit who maintained a respectable front for the community. She was the public face of the Trafficante family's legitimacy, hosting gatherings, attending church, and raising the children, all while possessing, at least on some level, understanding of the true source of her family's fortune. This required a profound form of compartmentalization not unlike her husband's, a willing suspension of curiosity about the parts of his life that happened after dark, in back rooms and distant cities. Her strength was in her silence, in her ability to maintain the facade of a normal, upper-middle-class life amidst the swirling rumors and the occasional headline. His relationship with his mistress, Josephine Brown, was in many ways a reflection of his criminal operations, compartmentalized, discreet, and managed with meticulous care. She represented an escape, a separate world where he could perhaps let his guard down in a way he never could at home. Yet, even this intimate relationship was ultimately ensnared by his primary life. It was to Brown that he allegedly made his shocking prediction about President Kennedy's assassination, a moment that suggests a need to confide, to share the immense pressure he was under, even if only in a veiled and cryptic way. This single moment of vulnerability, whether a boast or a grim forecast, would later become a critical piece of evidence against him, dragging her into the very public nightmare of a congressional investigation and forever linking her name to one of America's greatest tragedies. For her, the affair was not just a secret romance, it became a burden of historical significance, a secret she carried for years before finally testifying, a decision that itself must have been fraught with fear and conflict. For his daughters, the experience was likely one of profound confusion. In the insulated environment of their home, their father was likely a loving, attentive figure, a man who provided for them and doted on them. Yet, outside the home, his name was a whisper, a subject of fear and fascination. They would have had to navigate the chasm between the private man they adored and the public figure of sinister reputation. As they grew older, the reality of their father's world would have become increasingly unavoidable, forcing them to reconcile their personal love for him with the knowledge of his actions. This is a common, painful legacy for the children of powerful criminals, a life sentence of grappling with a dual inheritance of affection and infamy. The women in Trafficant's life were, in effect, collateral damage. They did not choose the life of crime, but they were forced to live with its consequences every single day. They were denied the simple luxury of transparency, of being able to talk openly about their husband or father without a filter of caution and fear. Their lives were a performance, a carefully maintained illusion of normalcy that could be shattered at any moment by a subpoena, a newspaper story, or an act of violence. In this, their experience mirrors that of countless other families tied to organized crime, a reminder that the true cost of such empires is not paid only by rival gangsters or addicted users, but by the wives, daughters, and sons who live in the long, quiet shadow of a life of crime, forever bound by loyalty and love to a man whose world was built on secrets and sustained by sin. The legal and legislative battles that swirled around Santo Trafficante Jr. throughout his long career created a fascinating, decades-long duel between his shadow empire and the expanding power of the American justice system, a conflict that saw him consistently outmaneuver his pursuers not through dramatic courtroom acquittals, but through a masterful strategy of delay, obstruction, and exploiting the very rules designed to constrain him. His encounters with the law began locally, where his father's well-established corruption of the Tampa police and sheriff's departments provided a formidable first line of defense. Arrests for minor violations were often dismissed, charges were mysteriously dropped, and witnesses would develop a sudden and profound amnesia when called to testify. This local impunity gave him the foundation and the confidence to operate on a larger stage. As his ambitions grew, so did the level of his legal adversaries. The Kefauver Committee in the early 1950s, a nationwide investigation into organized crime, first brought his name to national attention, but it was a mere glimpse, a warning of the scrutiny to come. The real battle began in earnest with the rise of Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General in the early 1960s. Kennedy's war on the mob was personal, relentless, and unprecedented in its scope. He deployed the full arsenal of the federal government, from the FBI to the IRS, aiming to imprison top mobsters on any charge that would stick, from tax evasion to perjury. For the first time, Trafficante faced an opponent with resources that dwarfed his own and a motivation that was immune to his usual tools of bribery and intimidation. He was subpoenaed, surveilled, and hauled before grand juries with increasing frequency. His response was a masterclass in passive-aggressive legal resistance. He became a phantom in the courtroom, invoking the Fifth Amendment so routinely and completely that it became his shield. He understood that the burden of proof was on the state, and he would offer them nothing, no information, no admission, no helpful clue. He turned the constitutional protection against self-incrimination into a strategic weapon, frustrating prosecutors and leaving juries with nothing but the prosecution's case, which was often built on the shaky foundation of reluctant or compromised witnesses. His trials were not spectacles, they were slow, grinding affairs of attrition. His lawyers, among the best that his illicit wealth could buy, fought every procedural point, filed endless motions, and challenged the smallest technicalities, dragging out proceedings for years in the hope that witnesses would disappear, memories would fade, or the government's resolve would wane. This strategy was brilliantly effective. While other mobsters were being convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, Trafficante remained a frustratingly elusive target. The few times he was convicted, such as on a contempt charge, the sentences were minor and often overturned on appeal. The passage of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, RICO, Act in 1970 was designed specifically to combat bosses like him, by allowing prosecutors to target the entire organization for the crimes of its members. Yet, even this powerful legal tool proved difficult to apply to the Ghost Don. His decentralized structure and his deep insulation meant that connecting him directly to a pattern of racketeering activity was a monumental challenge. The ultimate legal confrontations of his life were, of course, his testimonies before the Church Committee and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Here, he was no longer facing a courtroom but the court of public opinion and historical judgment. His performance before the HSCA was the apex of his legal strategy. He was calm, polite, and utterly uncooperative. The "I don't remember" refrain was not just a legal tactic, it was a demonstration of his contempt for the process and his unwavering confidence in his ability to withstand it. He knew that without a smoking gun, the committee could not break him, and he was right. The HSCA could conclude that he was likely involved, but they could not indict him. This decades-long duel left an important legacy in American jurisprudence. The relentless, yet ultimately futile, pursuit of Trafficante by figures like Robert Kennedy demonstrated the limitations of traditional law enforcement approaches when facing a criminal of such sophistication and resources. It helped build the case for powerful new tools like RICO and for the Witness Protection Program, which was essential for breaking the code of silence. In a way, Santo Trafficante Jr. was a catalyst for the modernization of the American justice system's fight against organized crime. He was the high-value target that forced the system to innovate, to become more sophisticated in its own right. Yet, in the final tally, he won their personal war. He forced the most powerful nation on earth to create new laws and new agencies to catch him, and he still managed to die a free man, his ultimate victory being not an acquittal, but a lifetime of impunity, a testament to the fact that in a system built on evidence, the most perfect crime is the one that leaves none behind. The cultural footprint of Santo Trafficante Jr., while far less prominent in the public imagination than that of Al Capone or John Gotti, is nonetheless significant, woven into the fabric of American media and folklore as a recurring archetype, the quiet, powerful, and ultimately untouchable Kingpin who operates from the shadows. He never sought the celebrity of a Capone, but his very elusiveness and the profound scope of his alleged conspiracies have made him a compelling character for novelists, screenwriters, and historians seeking to understand the darker undercurrents of 20th century America. In literature, he is often the model for the sophisticated, behind-the-scenes mobster who understands that true power lies in influence, not intimidation. He is the ghost that haunts the pages of crime fiction, the unseen force that characters fear but rarely see, a representation of a systemic corruption that is far more frightening than any lone, violent thug. His specific story, particularly his reign in Cuba, forms the essential historical backdrop for iconic works like Mario Puzo's The Godfather, where the character of Hyman Roth in the film The Godfather Part II is a direct and acknowledged composite of Trafficante and his mentor Meyer Lansky. The famous line, "We're bigger than U.S. Steel," captures the corporate, national, and almost imperial ambition that Trafficante embodied. His was a vision of crime not as a series of street-level robberies, but as a vast, interconnected conglomerate with its own foreign policy, an idea that was both terrifying and revolutionary. In film and television, his influence is equally pervasive. Beyond the direct portrayal in The Godfather Part II, his persona, the calm, aging, strategically brilliant Don who avoids the spotlight, has become a stock character in crime sagas. He is the antithesis of the hot-headed young gangster, a reminder that in the criminal world, the most dangerous individuals are often the ones who appear the most benign. Documentary filmmaking has been particularly fascinated with him, not for a flashy lifestyle, but for the profound mysteries he represents. He is a central figure in countless documentaries about the JFK assassination, the CIA-Mafia plots, and the history of organized crime. His photograph, a balding, bespectacled man who could be anyone's grandfather, serving as a chilling visual representation of the banality of evil. The very fact that he does not look the part of a monstrous crime lord makes him all the more compelling and terrifying to audiences. He is proof that evil can wear a mundane face. Furthermore, his life provides a rich, factual foundation for some of the most enduring conspiracy theories in American history. For those who believe the official narrative of Lee Harvey Oswald as a lone gunman is insufficient, Trafficante offers a plausible and powerfully motivated alternative. He connects the dots between the mob's fury over the loss of Cuba and Robert Kennedy's crusade, the CIA's desperation, and the ultimate, tragic event in Dallas. In the world of conspiracy, he is not a minor character but a potential mastermind, a symbol of a shadow government operating outside the bounds of democracy. This has cemented his place in an alternative American history, a pantheon of figures who allegedly pulled the strings from behind the curtain. Even in the world of true crime podcasts and YouTube deep dives, his story is catnip for creators and audiences alike. The layers of his empire, the unsolved murders, the mysterious connections to world-shaking events, and the sheer duration of his criminal career provide endless material for multi-part series that seek to unravel the puzzle. The search for the truth about Santo Trafficante Jr. is a driving force for a genre built on mystery and investigation. His cultural legacy, therefore, is one of pervasive influence rather than overt fame. He did not become a caricature or a cartoonish villain. Instead, he became a template, an archetype of the modern criminal executive whose story forces us to question the official versions of history and to consider the unsettling possibility that the most powerful forces in our society are often the ones we cannot see, the quiet men in quiet rooms whose decisions echo through time, shaping our world in ways we are only beginning to understand. The geographical footprint of the Trafficante Empire, a map charted not by national borders but by the flow of illicit goods, corrupt influence, and strategic necessity, reveals a network that was both sprawling and precisely targeted, a cartography of crime that stretched from the local to the global with Tampa as its resilient, enduring heart. At the center of this map was always Ybor City, the vibrant, immigrant-rich neighborhood of Tampa where his father had planted the family's roots. This was more than just a base of operations, it was a fortress and a sanctuary. The intricate social fabric of the community, built on shared language and culture, provided a perfect ecosystem for the Bolita rackets to thrive and a natural shield against outside observation. Here, the Trafficante name was not infamous, it was influential, a part of the local landscape. The countless social clubs, cafes, and storefronts of the district were the capillaries of his power, places where information was gathered, money was collected, and loyalties were reinforced. From this secure headquarters, his influence radiated outward across the state of Florida. He established firm control over criminal activities in Miami, a city whose rapid growth and transient population made it a perfect hub for narcotics distribution and money laundering. Key West, with its proximity to Cuba, became a critical transshipment point for everything from bootlegged alcohol during Prohibition to heroin and refugees in later decades. His reach extended north through the cigar-producing regions of Florida and into the gambling parlors of other southern cities, creating a regional dominion that made him the undisputed crime boss of the American South. But it was the expansion beyond the United States that truly defined his ambitions and his legacy. The island of Cuba, a mere 300 miles from Key West, was the glittering jewel in his crown. In the 1950s, under the compliant regime of Fulgencio Batista, Havana was transformed into a virtual fiefdom for the American Mafia, and Trafficante was its on-the-ground CEO. His map of the city was a guide to its underworld, the Sans Souci Cabaret, the Casino Internacional at the Havana Riviera, and most famously, the Tropicana Club. These were not just business ventures, they were command centers, the places where he negotiated with Cuban officials, managed the flow of profits, and solidified his alliances with figures like Meyer Lansky. This Cuban enterprise was the pinnacle of his power, a seamless fusion of illicit activity with official state protection. The loss of Cuba in 1959 was therefore not just a financial catastrophe, it was a geographical amputation, the loss of his most valuable overseas territory. However, his network was resilient. The connections he had built with Cuban exiles, port officials, and shipping operators during the Havana years were quickly repurposed. The same routes that once moved high rollers and casino profits now began to move narcotics and, according to some investigations, weapons and assassins. The Caribbean itself became his domain, a liquid territory he navigated with impunity. His connections extended back to the old country, to Sicily, where his father's origins in Castellamare del Golfo provided a direct link to the source of the heroin that would fuel his empire's next phase. This transatlantic pipeline, from the poppy fields of the Middle East through Sicilian refiners, across the Mediterranean, into Cuba and Mexico, and finally through the ports of Florida and into the veins of American cities, was a logistical marvel, a dark counterpart to the legitimate global trade routes of the post-war era. Later in his career, his map would expand to include new frontiers like the emerging casino paradise of Las Vegas, where he held hidden interests, and the cocaine source countries of South America. Yet, through it all, he always returned to Tampa. It was his anchor, the one place where he was not a visitor or a foreign investor, but a local institution. This geographical strategy was a key to his longevity. By operating from a secondary city like Tampa, he avoided the constant, intense scrutiny that mobsters in New York and Chicago faced. He could project power outward without making his home base a primary target. The map of his life is a testament to a criminal vision that was borderless and adaptive, understanding that true power in the modern world lay not in controlling a single neighborhood, but in mastering the connections between them, in building an empire that was not defined by land, but by routes, relationships, and the silent, unimpeded flow of illicit capital. The philosophical underpinnings of Santo Trafficante Jr.'s worldview, a dark and pragmatic code that guided his every decision, reveal a man who saw society not as a system of laws and morals, but as a complex ecosystem of power, weakness, and opportunity, where the only true sin was failure and the only real virtue was success. His was a philosophy forged in the immigrant enclaves of Ybor City, refined in the bootlegging runs of the Prohibition era, and perfected in the glittering, corrupt casinos of Havana, a belief system that can be best understood as a form of criminal realism. He operated on the fundamental premise that every man, from the lowest street sweeper to the highest government official, had a price, a weakness, or a secret desire that could be leveraged. This was not cynicism for its own sake, but a cold, operational conclusion drawn from a lifetime of observation. He saw that the police could be bribed, that judges could be influenced, that politicians craved power and money, and that the public was willing to overlook almost anything in exchange for the services he provided: the dream of a winning number, the thrill of a casino, the escape of a narcotic. In his view, the official structures of society, the government, the courts, the church, were not sacred institutions, but merely competing power centers, some more organized and legitimized than his own, but operating on the same basic principles of self-interest. This perspective allowed him to navigate the world with a unique detachment. He felt no particular animosity towards the law, he simply saw it as a force of nature, like a river that could be dammed, diverted, or navigated, but never truly stopped. His famous calmness was the outward manifestation of this internal philosophy. He did not experience the rage or panic that stemmed from a belief that the world was unjust. He believed the world was exactly as it was, a game with defined, if unwritten, rules, and his job was simply to play it better than anyone else. His strategic use of violence was also a product of this worldview. Violence was not an emotional outburst, it was a precise tool, a form of communication. A murder was a statement, a message to rivals and subordinates about the cost of disloyalty or competition. It was a business expense, to be used sparingly and efficiently, because unnecessary violence was messy, attracted attention, and was, in his terms, bad for business. This is why he so deeply despised the flashy, emotional gangsters who ruled through terror. They were amateurs who failed to understand the subtle economics of power. His philosophy also encompassed a profound belief in the power of patience and the long view. While others sought quick scores and immediate dominance, Trafficante was playing a game that spanned decades. He was willing to forego a short-term profit for long-term stability, to absorb a temporary loss to avoid a permanent war. This was evident in his seamless succession after his father's death, his careful cultivation of political relationships over years, and his ability to quietly rebuild his empire after the catastrophic loss of Cuba. He understood that time was a weapon, and that he could outweight his enemies, outlast investigating committees, and allow public outrage to fade, emerging from each crisis stronger and more deeply entrenched than before. Ultimately, his guiding principle was control. Not the flamboyant, egotistical control of a dictator, but the quiet, absolute control of a master strategist. He sought to control his environment by corrupting it, to control his rivals by outthinking them, and to control his own destiny by maintaining his freedom. His entire life was a sustained exercise in risk management, a relentless effort to eliminate variables and unpredictability. The wealth he accumulated was not the goal, but merely the scorecard and the fuel for this pursuit of ultimate autonomy. In the end, the philosophy of Santo Trafficante Jr. presents us with a deeply unsettling vision, a man who achieved the American dream of wealth, power, and influence, but did so by systematically inverting its moral foundations. He replaced faith in institutions with a belief in their corruptibility, replaced the social contract with the law of the jungle, and replaced the pursuit of happiness with the pursuit of total, unassailable control. His life stands as a dark testament to the fact that a philosophy, no matter how bleak, can be stunningly effective if applied with enough intelligence, discipline, and ruthless consistency, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that in the annals of human endeavor, success and morality are not always, and perhaps not even often, aligned. And so, we arrive at the final reckoning, the ultimate summation of the life and legacy of Santo Trafficante Jr., a man who defied every convention and expectation to become the most successful and elusive crime boss in American history. His story is not one of redemption, nor is it a simple tale of villainy. It is a complex and sobering case study in the nature of power itself. From his beginnings in the vibrant, immigrant world of Ybor City to his quiet death in a Tampa hospital, his journey was a masterclass in strategic thinking, patience, and the disciplined application of force. He inherited a criminal enterprise from his father and transformed it into a transnational corporation, a shadowy conglomerate with interests in gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, and political manipulation. He was a king who preferred the title of CEO, a warrior who understood that the most decisive battles are won not with bullets, but with bribes, and with the silent, patient corruption of the systems designed to stop him. His name is forever linked to the most pivotal and tragic events of the mid-20th century, the rise and fall of the mob's paradise in Havana, the CIA's desperate plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, and the enduring, haunting mystery of the Kennedy assassination. Through it all, he remained an enigma, a ghost in the machine of American power, his calm, bespectacled face betraying none of the immense violence and ambition that churned beneath the surface. His greatest achievement was not the wealth he accumulated, which was vast, nor the territory he controlled, which was extensive. His ultimate triumph was his freedom. In a world where his contemporaries fell to gangland hits, life sentences, and dramatic public downfalls, Santo Trafficante Jr. navigated 7 decades of criminal enterprise without ever serving a significant prison term. He faced down the relentless crusade of Robert F. Kennedy, the investigative powers of the United States Congress, and the constant surveillance of the FBI, and he outmaneuvered them all. He proved that the most effective criminal is not the loudest, but the quietest, not the most violent, but the most patient, not the one who defies the system, but the one who learns to co-opt it, to weave his illicit interests so deeply into the fabric of the legitimate economy and political structure that extracting him becomes impossible. His legacy is therefore a double-edged sword. For the world of law enforcement and criminology, he remains the one that got away, a benchmark of criminal sophistication and a reminder of the enduring challenge of combating a foe who operates with corporate efficiency and philosophical detachment. For historians, he is a pivotal and troubling figure, a man who forces us to re-examine the clean narratives of the Cold War and acknowledge the dark, symbiotic relationships that festered in the shadows of the American century. And for the public, his story is a permanent cautionary tale, a reminder that the most dangerous forces in our society are often not the ones that announce themselves with fanfare and violence, but the ones that operate in the quiet spaces, the unrecorded meetings, and the ambiguous transactions that shape our world from behind a veil of normalcy. The ghost of Santo Trafficante Jr. has not faded with time. It lingers in the unanswered questions of our national history, in the continued fascination with the hidden mechanics of power, and in the unsettling realization that the architecture of impunity he designed remains a viable blueprint for those who would follow in his footsteps. His life forces a single, profound question upon us. What does it mean to succeed in a world where the rules are, as he believed, merely suggestions for the weak? In answering that, we must confront the full, ambiguous, and deeply disquieting legacy of the man who was, by his own dark metrics, the most successful American criminal of them all. This concludes our extensive exploration into the life of Santo Trafficante Jr. We have journeyed through his rise, his empire, his connections to world-altering events, and his quiet, unpunished demise. If this deep, narrative investigation has provided you with value, if it has offered new insights and a deeper understanding of this complex chapter in history, then your support would be greatly appreciated. Please help us continue to produce this level of detailed, long-form content by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and ringing the notification bell. Your engagement is what allows independent creators to dedicate the time and resources necessary to bring these comprehensive stories to life. Thank you for listening.